Welcome to Inclusion Matters, a podcast about children's development from the Center for Inclusive Childcare.
Welcome to Inclusion Matters, a podcast from the Center for Inclusive Childcare. I'm Priscilla Weigel, and I'm the Executive Director, and I'm here today with my colleague, Sandy Heidemann, who is one of our fabulous RBPD specialists, relationship-based professional development specialists, one of our coaches who is out in childcare settings supporting all of you. And she also is a published author and has written 7 different books, and 3 of those books really relate to play. And play is essential to a successful childhood. And some children, I think, feel that, or some people think that all kids are just automatically great at playing. So I'm glad you're here today, Sandy, to talk to us more about play.
Great.
And so your books really look at the whole pathway from theory to practice when we look at play. And then you have a couple workbooks that also go with that. One of them is When Play Isn't Fun, and another one is When Play Isn't Easy. And so I think that those tools really do, those titles get us all thinking, okay, have I ever worked with a child where play hasn't been fun and play hasn't been easy? And I think we can all say yes to that question. Mm-hmm. And so I think, if you want to just start with what's so essential in a child's life, why is play so important?
Okay. Well, I think this is a question that could go on and on because it's such a rich question. And really what happens in play is almost like magic. When it's going well, people really feel included and part of a bigger picture, part of a bigger story. And it's so exciting for kids when it really is clicking. When it isn't going well, there are fights over materials, there's disappointment, there's hurt. And those are the kinds of things that in a classroom and a home, we can work to bridge some of those differences for kids. Mm-hmm. So that's really why Deb Hewitt and I wrote the books, is that we worked in therapeutic settings and we saw that there were children who just had a really hard time entering a place, with other children. So that's why we wrote these books.
And wonderful tools, because I think too, when I look back to my time in early childhood classrooms, I taught for many years, and you really look at children and you think, this is supposed to be the most fun time of your life. And you're supposed to really, we're supposed to be providing a setting for children to really enjoy being together and nurturing and supporting each other and being responsive to each other as children, as peers. But I think sometimes we forget that sometimes they need a little help doing that. And so that's why I think I'm excited for you to talk with us today about how play really enhances not just their social emotional development and that connected interaction piece, but their whole being, all of their developmental domains.
What's really wonderful about play for young children is they are using all their developmental skills to participate. Mm-hmm. And so, when you think about language, which is really the key to communication for children, mm-hmm. play is filled with communication.
Right.
Children, they have to communicate to figure out what they're going to play. They have to communicate to solve problems. And they really need language skills, particularly at those levels of play they're doing at 4 and 5. When they're building stories and scenarios together and they say, oh, what about that shark over there? Oh, no, now we're scared. We got to go away.
Yeah.
Well, they have to have language in order to do that.
Right.
Right. One of the things that I saw over and over again is when kids had trouble, when they had a language delay, they had a really hard time joining in, figuring out how to get into the play, figuring out how to be a character. Mm-hmm. It was really difficult for them. So language is a big component.
Right.
But one of the things that we don't often think about, I think, is the cognitive component. Mm. because for children, the first place that they learn to symbolize, and what is reading and what is math, it's symbolizing systems, right? That, you can't always get a hold of. It's in your head that you are organizing this. Well, they learn to symbolize with objects, and it starts really young. And they learn that when they're really young, the stick is a stick, right?
Yes.
It's a
Yeah.
real object. But then as they get older, they start to think, oh, well, this could be a cane, or this could be a spoon, and they imagine all other kinds of things. And then when they're very sophisticated, they learn that I don't even need an object. I can just hand over money and pretend it's money.
Yeah.
And so their play becomes very rich because they aren't dependent on that object to necessarily move the story along.
Sure. That's fun. That's one of my favorite things. I love being in a room with children who are playing and using their imaginations and their creativity in that way. And they are just completely engrossed and enthralled with the whole theme. And they don't even know you're there as that adult. That's one of my favorite things to do is just to watch it all happen before our eyes. Yeah.
It's so great. It is so exciting to see that,
Yeah.
and just sit back and let them do it. Doesn't need your organizing. Once you've given those props, then you can
Yeah.
just sit back
Right.
and enjoy it.
Yeah.
The other thing is, motor development is really important to play too.
Sure.
Just to manipulate the objects, just to be included in the play. And, sometimes play can be demanding, particularly outdoors.
Right.
You can be called on to do some really big things with your motor development. And then, you mentioned socio-emotional development, and that is really, really important to children, and learning things like I don't have to always be the boss.
Yes.
I can share leadership. I can work through my problems.
Yeah.
I can say what I feel. And that is really a very very important part of play, is
Right.
that socio-emotional component.
Sure. Yeah. Negotiating for those roles. Not always wanting to be the baby. I'd like to be the mother. I'd like to be the dad. I'd like to be the grandma. I'd like to be the boss, and that takes time for some kids to kind of get their feet under them and be able to stand up and ask for those opportunities too. So it's a great practice.
Yeah. And one of the things I always used to love watching is when a child would be the mother, and then another child would put their hand on their hip and go, that's not the way mothers act.
Right. I know it. Yeah. It's always fun to be the observer and hear what's going on in those interchanges.
Yeah. And, children play what they see.
Yes.
Children play what's around them. That doesn't necessarily mean that all their play is literal and that actually has happened to them. But it does mean that they're showing us part of their, well, this is a little romantic, but their soul.
Yes.
It's what's important to them, what makes sense to them, what they love, what they're scared of. So they really are giving us a window into who they are.
That's beautiful. That is beautiful. And, when you think about what we provide as the adults in their world to allow them, you mentioned giving those props, especially for children who are not quite to that real dramatic play stage of just imagining some of those tools and resources. We need to provide them with opportunities each day so that they can practice that time together, that time being creative. So, not necessarily keeping the same things out all the time, but adding some new things here and there. If you notice a child who doesn't always get included, giving them a real hot prop that other children will be really keyed into, and let them bring it over to that area so that they're invited in and have, especially for the child who has some challenges with the communication piece that you said. I think if you can't initiate verbally and say, I want to play with you, sometimes you use other means. You might go over and crash down their tower. You might knock something over to get their attention, and that can cause some friction. So some of those pieces that we might observe as, challenging behavior are really the child's attempt to play.
And I could talk about this a little bit later too, but when I coach and I see a child who's knocking over towers,
Mhm.
first thing I ask is, what is their language level?
Yeah, yeah, yep.
Because that is a primary way to get into a group. It's
Oh,
not
sure.
successful.
Right. But it gets people's attention.
They get,
That's
they get in there.
Yeah, they do. They do. Well, it's kind of this leads us into that topic of children that might have some, challenges related to play or communication or any of those domains of development that really cause them to be sometimes on the outside looking in to play. You know, so if we look at that whole piece of language, it can create, we mentioned you can get people's attention with knocking down a tower, but that's not the kind of way you want to begin your play scenario.
Mm-mm. No. And those children, they end up feeling really bad about themselves because the reaction from their peers and friends are, no, you can't play with us. You knocked down my tower.
Yeah.
And so children are very practical in the sense that, no, I don't want you knocking down my tower.
Right.
So it's not a good strategy for them. And
No.
language, not having language really affects how they create a scenario, how they negotiate roles. It
Mhm.
really creates a situation where they may always have to play the same role, and
Mhm.
like a dog or a
Yeah.
baby,
Uh-huh.
and that doesn't feel good.
No. Right.
And one of the things that I think is important to think about is how speaking a different language than English, how that affects play. If
Right.
you're trying to have groups that have English, the English is the main language, and
Right.
those children who don't speak it, how do they come into the play?
Mhm.
And how do they manage some of those relationships? Um, so it's very complicated, and I think sometimes we minimize play.
Mhm.
Like parents will come in and say, "Well, they're just playing," because they really, of course, want their children to be learning the school kinds of skills, but
Right.
they are learning the school skills
Right.
during play. So
Yeah. And I think, helping folks who are educating young children with being able to articulate and understand the learning that's happening in that situation, which you have done beautifully during our conversation here, is just really looking at those components that create successful play situations. And then also our role as the grown up in the room, and what does that look like, and how can we foster that? And we're going to do another podcast with you, Sandy, and talk about how we as adults can really help the situation move forward in a positive way. And I love that you brought up children who are not using English, but the play is all in English. Being in tune as that adult in the room and watching. We talk all the time about how beautiful observation is when you're in an early childhood setting, because taking the time, even though it seems like we often don't have the time because we're doing a million things at once, but taking the time each day to really step back, watch, observe, see how everyone's doing in those play situations, and also pulling in a coach, perhaps. I mean, certainly CICC coaches spend a lot of time helping those who are providing care to be that extra set of eyes in that classroom setting or in that family child care, because that's when you really do get a chance to see the challenges or the huge successes that maybe have been a long time coming. And those triumphs where you think, wow, that child has knocked over the tower for the last 3 weeks to try to get their attention, and today They walked over and they looked like they were going to knock it down, but they didn't. And they just stood on the outskirts and watched. Well, that's a huge step forward because they're starting to kind of put the pieces together to go, okay, that didn't work. I've got to try something new.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. Yeah.
Oh, that's so one thing that we always try to do on our podcast, Sandy, is engage our listeners a little bit. So I have a question for our listeners out there is just wondering what your favorite play experience is that you offer in your setting. I know for me, I always love to have a refrigerator box that I just kept reusing. And so we call it the year in the life of a box, and we just keep changing it into different things. But that dramatic play opportunity to really just use their imagination and, they have the children in the group say what they wanted the box to be next, and then paint it, cut it, move it, duct tape it, whatever. But providing opportunities in your setting. What's your favorite? We'd love to hear from you in response on our social media. So I think what we're going to do, Sandy, is save our rest of our conversation for our next podcast when we look at adults in our role. And I thank you for being here and helping us really learn a little bit more about those key components of play and all that that does for a child and their overall development. And also, I'm so grateful that you're on our team as a coach. And I know that the work that you do out there across the state and in the metro area primarily is so supportive of children and what's really best for them in a compassionate and kind way. So I appreciate that about you. And thank you for being here. And I look forward to continuing our conversation in our next podcast. For those of you listening, if you want to reach out to us at our website, it's inclusivechildcare.org. We have resources, other podcasts. We have also, you can follow us on our social media, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. And we look forward to engaging you in the future on other things that you think would be useful as far as topics. So thank you, Sandy, and I look forward to talking to you soon.
It was great. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. For more resources, visit us at inclusivechildcare.org.